Hey everybody, Mr. Moppin coming back at you with another APUSH video. Once again, we're taking a look at topic 6.2, focusing in on the economic development as part of westward expansion. Now, last time we were talking about the impact of the railroad industry that was connecting the east and the western parts of the United States. We also talked about the emerging mining industry and the boom towns, which sometimes turned into ghost towns. But today we're going to be taking a look at the impact of the cattle ranching industry and the emerging farming movements of the Great Plains. So let's start off with talking about, cattle, steaks. I don't know about you folks, but I do like a tasty steak. Sorry, vegetarians and vegans. But what you see there is the Texas Longhorn. Now, the Texas Longhorn is a special breed of cattle. It is going to be bred to be able to withstand rough, extreme temperatures, relatively speaking, but also have very tender meat. And so as we start to see the interconnectedness of places like, say, Texas and far eastern away cities like New York and Boston, Philadelphia, etc., there's going to be a desire for the wealthy folks in New York City at their fancy restaurants to get their hands on one of these Texas Longhorn steaks. Now, the question is, how do you get, Mr. Cattle over here to that dinner plate in New York? Well, you're going to need the help of some cowboys for sure. And American cowboys actually get their origin from Mexican vaqueros that had been a part of ranching for many, many generations. And when we talk about, things like the use of lariats and chaps and spurs and all these accoutrements that we think of with the American cowboy, these are actually really importations. These are imports from, Mexican vaquero cowboys. Now, when we are talking about, getting these, cattle to the dinner plates, well, it really is getting the cattle driven from where the cattle are naturally in Texas to the closest rail lines to Texas at the time. And, the 1870s, 1880s, the closest rail lines are going to be located up here near Kansas and Missouri. And so basically, we're going to see a very kind of a short-term industry. It's going to last about one generation of young men that are going to be hired to literally escort and drive, these thousands of head of cattle north from Texas all the way up to where these rail lines are. Now, moving these cattle north is not going to be an easy thing. They get spooked by rough weather, thunderstorms or tornadoes or whatever. Remember, this is in Tornado Alley. You've got Native Americans that might be, disrupting things. You've got to be able to, get your cattle across the mighty Red River here between Texas and what's going to eventually become Oklahoma. You don't take care of that properly, you're going to have cows floating downstream, and you're not going to be able to get them. So there's going to be a number of things that are going to be problematic, challenges to get that cattle north to the railheads. But, when you do that, though, there is tremendous money to be made. Basically, what happens is that when these cattle are driven north and they end up at one of these railheads, like, for example, Abilene, Kansas up here, they're sold at what's called the railhead. Now, these railheads are going to be very similar to the boom towns that you're going to see emerging in, places, out west, like these mining camps. There's going to be a very similar kind of thing, same kind of rowdiness and lawlessness and yada, yada, yada. But bottom line, if you're a cowboy, you're going to sell that, all those head of cattle to the rail line, and those head of cattle are going to get shipped northeast, generally to Chicago up here. And the reason why is Chicago will begin to emerge as basically the great slaughterhouse of America. At the stockyards up there, and at the stockyards up there, this is where they get butchered, this is where they get slaughtered, they turn into steaks and all sorts of other, cuts of meat, processed meat, all that kind of stuff. And then from Chicago, shipped all over the United States, particularly to the East Coast. So that's kind of, how you made your way, and that's kind of how the industry worked. Now, that being said, these trails that were initially used, for example, if you're looking at the Chisholm Trail right here, the Goodnight Loving Trail, these are a couple of famous ones. This was back during a period known as the Open Range, where basically, this was open land. I mean, government-owned land, and basically you did not see territory and property that was fenced off. So you could just freely drive your cattle through there. Well, over time, as more and more people make their way out into this part of America, people are going to be outright buying property. And when they do buy their property, they don't want thousands of head of cattle just going through it. They're going to begin to fence off their territories. And in particular, they're going to start to use a new modern invention, barbed wire. And when you see these barbed wire fences start to be put up, well, now this creates tremendous challenges for the ranchers, because now they have to move the cattle in a different direction and try to get around the fences. In many cases, these cowboys are not going to be willing to go around the fences. They'll just cut the barbed wire, they'll cut the fences down, and still drive the cattle through them. Well, of course, the farmers that, owning that property that have put up the fencing, they get upset. They begin to, fire their guns at the cowboys. Cowboys fire back. There's going to be a number of what they call range wars back in the day. So that's going to be a problem for these cowboys. There's going to be one particularly horrific winter of 1885 into 1886, where you're going to see about 90% of the cattle industry be destroyed in one blizzard. So there's going to be a lot of folks that invested in the cattle, and they lost it all in just one horrifically bad winter. But what's really going to bring an end to this era is going to be the rail lines. Remember, the whole reason why you needed to do the drives in the first place was because, this is where the closest railroads were. Well, once you start to see rail lines moving into Texas, you don't have to drive them nearly as far. So what we kind of describe today as the classic American cowboy, driving cattle, it only really lasts about 20 years, from about 1870 to about 1890. That's about it. But still, though, that generation is going to have a profound cultural impact on America to this very day. Now, in addition to the cattle ranching industry, farming is going to be expanding into the Great Plains. Now, of course, farming, still into the late 19th century is going to be the most common occupation for Americans, but now we're starting to see farming go across the Mississippi River and head into the Great Plains. And it is, in many respects, if you drive through it, there's a lot of beauty to the Great Plains. I mean, you can take a look at this from North Dakota right here. There was a lot of beauty, but there weren't a whole lot of Americans living there. Yes, there were Native Americans, but just like with the rail lines, the federal government wanted more white Americans to settle this territory and cultivate this territory. And this is going to lead to the passage of the Homestead Act, which we had mentioned previously. Remember, the Homestead Act is going to award 160 acres of free land to any family that would be willing to move out to the Great Plains and farm the land for, anywhere from about 3 to 5 years. And as you can see here, there are going to be hundreds of thousands of people taking advantage of the Homestead Act, millions of people in general moving out to the Great Plains. Some of it will include former slaves known as exodusters. There's going to be immigrants. There's going to be a whole lot of folks beginning to make their way into places like, Nebraska, Kansas, the Dakotas, western Iowa, parts of, eastern Montana and Colorado, and, all those places. And, when somebody thinks, 160 acres of free land, holy smokes, I've hit the lottery, because 160 acres of land in some place like Ohio, boy, you could make some money. But when they get out there, and yes, there is a beauty to it, there's also tremendous challenges. As you take a look out here, you'll see there's no trees. How are you going to build a house with no trees? There are fewer rivers, and those rivers tend to be a little drier than what you see. This land is known for extreme temperatures. Summertime heat that can get into the triple digits, and winters that can go below 0. It gets very hot in the summer, very cold in the winter, and oh yeah, don't forget this is Tornado Alley. So you're going to face tremendous challenges with the natural geography. On top of that, when you're moving out here, you are really going to be facing isolation. It's not like there's a town nearby or a church nearby. You know, you could literally go weeks into months without seeing anybody else outside of your family. That can be, you know, pretty emotionally challenging for folks that maybe were used to living in a big city or even a small town. So for these early, you know, plains farmers, it is going to be nothing short of, you know, really, really tough. Now, that being said, you know, these folks are going to have to try to adapt as best they can. You know, for example, what do you do with lack of trees? Well, you use what you got. If you don't got trees, you use dirt, or what we call sod. This is an example of a sod house that was built out on the frontier. I think this is Texas. And basically what you did is you took pieces of, you know, you scooped up dirt and you mix it with straw, you know, maybe, some other things, you know, like, for example, you know, cow dung or whatever, and you turn them into bricks, you shape them into bricks, and you set them out in the sun. And then the sun will dry those bricks, and that's what you use to make your homes out of. You can see in this example right here. Bricks of sod, you know, gaps filled in with straw and hay and, you know, mud and things like that. You know, even the root, I mean, you use what you had. You know, is glamorous? Heck no. But it keeps you, you know, out of the sun. It provides shelter in a place where you can't naturally build a log cabin. But still, though, even though some folks are going to become, show some ingenuity, the vast majority of folks that made it out to the plains to become homesteaders, they're not going to be successful. They're going to quit within just a few years. The reality is that 160 acres of land to try to grow crops on in that part of America was extremely difficult. Very hard to, you know, make a profit, for sure. And this is going to be a time when there's going to be a challenge with the entire farming industry anyway, with general overproduction, but we'll get to that later. But that being said, today, you know, we think of the Great Plains as the breadbasket of the world. And the reason that happens is that it's really going to be new technology and government investment that's going to transform the landscape dramatically and educate farmers on what they need to do to get the most out of the land that they have. You're going to see the emergence of what we call dry farming techniques. You know, the idea of using that minimal amount of water in the most efficient way possible. You know, growing certain types of crops, you know, like Russian wheat, that is much more conducive to thriving in, you know, extreme temperatures like you see in the Great Plains. Eventually, as we get, you know, into the 20th century, we're going to see the federal government begin to invest in dams so that you can see, you know, more water being saved to be used for farming. So understand that there's going to be tremendous amounts of hard work and government investment that's going to lead to really nothing short of a radical transformation of what is going to become the Great Plains. Now, we'll talk later on. Additional challenges are certainly going to be a part of this. We're just kind of scratching the surface, but we are right now kind of give you a sense of, you know, how did these farmers get here? Why were they there? And what were some of the initial challenges they faced and how they were able to have, you know, some degree of success, those that were able to tough it out. Okay? So we're going to leave it there for right now. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.